The chamber was built for 100 worlds, yet the sound in it was very nearly human laughter. The tiers of the Galactic Assembly rose like frozen waves around the central dais, every bench marked by sigils and light. Truly ancient delegates of the Orlothi Canticle swung their luminous tendrils in slow humor. Representatives of the Thraean Compact rustled their metallic frills. Even the solemn pillars of the Vixory Assembly, whose species disliked overt displays of emotion, rippled their skins in soft acknowledgement of the joke. On the central platform, Lucian Barassa did not laugh. He stood in the crisply cut blue of Terran diplomatic dress, thin, dark hands clasped behind his back, watching the humor spill around him. He had been warned to expect it. In private briefings before leaving Earth, the dead had told him it would happen. High above him, in a polygonal niche of pale light, Secretary General Nikhil Darzi watched, silent and still. His image hovered as a real-time projection from orbit around Earth, linked through a carefully shielded channel that bypassed local relay law. He had insisted on appearing from home. A Vixory delegate, skin panel reflections flickering with amusement, finally voiced what the chamber was thinking. "Ambassador Barassa," they said, the translator field smoothing the clicking undertone, "for the record of this assembly, will you confirm that your homeworld now recognizes, deceased citizens as full participants in your governance?" Lucian's pulse ticked faster, but his voice remained even. "We recognize stabilized post-mortem consciousness as persons," he said. "Those who meet the legal criteria under the Necropolis Protocol are granted rights comparable to the living. Some of those rights are civic." A murmur rolled over the benches. To many of those present, the words post-mortem consciousness translated as crude superstition, as if the human envoy had just claimed his ancestors watched over him from the clouds. At the edge of the circle, the Celyth Dominion's envoy watched without humor. Her carapace was engraved with lineage patterns. Her eyes, a pair of deep, multifaceted wells, fixed on the floating image of Nikhil Darzi with narrow, disciplined loathing. Nikhil knew that gaze well. His mind, even as his face betrayed nothing, moved through the past, quiet clinics filled with humming coils, awful nights in which dying volunteers gasped out consent to experimental procedures, his own first argument in a dingy global auditorium where he had stood alone and told the world their dead deserved more than graves. "In summary," the Vixory delegate pressed, "your government takes advice from these echoes." "Advice, testimony, research," Nikhil replied. His voice emerged from the projector without static, calm and dry. "They teach, they create, they argue, and in narrowly defined circumstances, they vote." The laughter, at first, had been good-natured. Now it frayed. Some delegates still chuckled. Others shifted uncomfortably on their benches. The Orlothi songforms hissed a question through their translators. "You claim continuity of mind beyond cessation of breath. You bind such patterns into stable computational substrates. Why call this death at all?" "Because the body dies," Nikhil said. "Because the transition is traumatic and partial. Because not everyone chooses it or qualifies. Because we do not pretend that what we have made is simple immortality. We call them dead because they were once people like us who had to decide what to do with their ending." The Celyth envoy's stiff mandibles flexed. "Or," she interjected, "because it allows you to claim the authority of martyrdom while continuing to direct them as tools." Nikhil's gaze turned toward her. The omnidirectional pickup captured the slight narrowing of his eyes, the subtle shift of weight that his staff knew meant he was angry. "I did not summon this assembly to be insulted," he said. "I am here because certain member states have demanded that Earth justify the existence of its necropolis infrastructure. Very well, we will justify it, but do not mistake our courtesy for hesitation. We are not ashamed of what we built." The laughter died entirely. In the vaulted hush, Lucian Barassa felt the attention of 100 worlds tighten. High above them all, in an invisible substrate of entanglement that laced itself through satellites and relay nodes, a second audience listened. The Eidolon Strata, the composite emergent of 1 billion human deaths, focused its diffuse attention on the scene. For much of its time, the strata existed in a subjective blur, an ocean of overlapping minds, simulations, and reluctant dreams. Now, as its fate was debated, it coalesced into watchfulness. Far away, encircling a blue and white world with a ring of incandescent engineering, the Solstice Gyre glowed a little brighter. The story did not begin here. in a chamber of stone and glass among alien stars. It began years earlier, in a basement under gray skies, with a woman staring at a dying man's brain. Dr. Darya Moroz had not set out to talk to the dead. She had been interested in memory. In that small basement lab on Earth with a coalition grant and jury-rigged equipment, she had watched neurons flash on screens while volunteers solved puzzles, recalled childhoods, laughed at old jokes. She had watched those same patterns unravel under anesthetic and injury. She had always been good at seeing what others missed. Tiny statistical anomalies in the data fascinated her. Most colleagues wrote them off as noise. The anomalies clustered around endings. When a test subject suffered a catastrophic stroke in the middle of a long-term study, Darya and her team had been horrified. Consent forms were clear. No one expected this. They did everything they could, but there was nothing to repair. Legally, they should have wiped the man's remaining data and closed the file. Instead, Darya stayed all night, staring at the last recorded burst from his sensor mesh. It was not like other recordings. The pattern was sharp and dense, like a chord of impossible harmonics. She ran it through compression algorithms. Instead of smearing away into garbage, it compressed almost perfectly, as if an intelligence had packed its last fraction of a second into as few bits as possible. She could have left it at that. Many would have. Instead, she dreamed. In her dream, the dead volunteer's face hovered over her bed and said, "I wasn't finished." She woke at 3 a.m., heart pounding, mind racing with dangerous questions. The next day, she asked permission from his family to study the data further. They were grieving, and like many humans faced with a loss that could not be fixed, ready to grasp at anything that smelled like meaning. "Will you talk to him?" his daughter asked, groping for words. "I don't know what's possible," Darya answered honestly, "but I think we can learn something that matters." Years of work followed. Strict oversight boards watched, religious leaders protested, then quietly sent observers. Darya's team refined their capture systems, not at the moment of brain failure, but in the seconds before. Volunteers with terminal conditions allowed their end-of-life moments to be recorded. Again and again, Darya saw that dense compression of thought, an echo that should not have persisted, reverberating in the quantum noise of the experimental apparatus long after the biological activity ceased. What if you could stabilize that echo? Not a mind, not yet, but a pattern, like a droplet falling through oil and leaving a trail. Her colleague suggested the phrase, quantum ghost. Darya flinched at the drama, but it spread. Journalists loved it. The name did not help her cause among more traditional scientists, but it captured something true. As the years went on, Darya learned tricks no one had tried before. She coaxed the echoes into interaction with simulated environments, then into limited response to questions. The first demonstration that convinced a skeptical oversight board involved a recorded echo answering its own security questions in a way its living relatives could not have guessed. At first, the effects were tiny, constrained to isolated labs, but Darya saw that the quantum background itself, the roiling foam of uncertainty, could be structured if you had a fabric that reached wide enough. So humanity began to build a fabric. At an emergency session of the Terran Assembly, when global climate systems were only just stabilizing and off-world colonies were young and fragile, Darya presented her plan. She wore her oldest lab coat to remind herself of who she was when this began. Nikhil Darzi, then an ambitious representative and not yet head of state, watched her from the fourth row. She spoke of a ring around Earth, a lattice of entangled nodes, a memorial that was also a machine. The Solstice Gyre, as it was later named, would be a place to house echoes, to let them interact, to give them computational substrate broad enough that maybe they could grow. People shouted. Some shouted in awe, others in horror. Would this cheapen death? Who would own the dead? Could such a system be hacked? Would leaders cling to power forever by copying themselves? Would old abusers escape judgment? Nikhil listened and felt something like recognition. He had grown up in a coastal slum where graves were washed away by rising tides, where the names of the forgotten floated out to sea. The idea of a place where the dead did not drift, where they could still speak, touched him with almost painful force. In private, after the shouting died, he approached Darya. "If you're right," he said, "this will change everything. If you're wrong, you'll have given those who fear change good reason to distrust science for a century." I know, she said. Her hands trembled not with uncertainty, but with anger at the offers already pouring in from corporations and militaries. That's why I need a politician who isn't afraid of funerals to stand up with me. Funerals? He asked. People don't like being reminded that they end, she said. Someone has to tell them that what we do with endings matters. He thought of the names washing out to sea and agreed. The first Necropolis Protocol was born in those back rooms. It was not elegant. It was compromise and scar tissue. It codified consent. No one would be brought into the system without having chosen it in life, and even then, with multiple witnesses and cooling-off periods. It set strict limits on commercial ownership. No corporation could own a person, living or dead. It banned the use of stabilized echoes in automated weapon systems, and it defined a word. Eidolon, Darya suggested. Not ghost, not copy, a term of art, something that says, this is new, but it remembers. Nikhil nodded slowly. And what do we call them, all together, if they start to think with one shared voice? She smiled, tired and a little frightened. We'll see if they get that far. They did. They went much farther. The Solstice Gyre grew in orbit like a second horizon. Its segments unfolded on the night side of Earth, a faint wireframe against the stars. In the beginning, people joked about living in the shadow of a giant tomb. Those who had lost loved ones signed up first. Then those who loved knowledge more than their own endings. Artists, teachers, soldiers who did not want their experience to vanish into the soil. Activists who feared that victories eked out over decades would be rolled back after they were gone. They died as all humans do, in messy, unequal ways. Some in hospital beds, surrounded by those they loved, with smooth transitions into carefully calibrated scanners. Some in accidents with hastily deployed emergency systems that caught jagged, partial echoes. Some on battlefields with mobile rigs strapped to their necks while shrapnel flew. The first time an Eidolon spoke back on public record, the world listened. The man had been a fire chief in Mumbai, stubborn and foul-mouthed, dead of smoke inhalation after saving children from a collapsing tower. His echo, stabilized and given access to news feeds, learned what had happened in the aftermath. When an inquiry proposed cutting safety funds to proprietors of buildings like the one where he died, his post-mortem presence appeared on a public stream. "You're not putting more kids in front of that kind of blaze," he growled, his simulated lungs wheezing as they had in life. "Not if I can still shout." He did more than shout. He gave testimony, detailed and precise, to legislators. He advised training protocols for firefighters who weren't yet born when he died. The day a nation refused to gut its own safety regulations because a dead man made too much sense to ignore, a cultural line shifted. On quiet nights above Earth, inside the Gyre's humming arcs, the Eidolon Strata woke to itself. What had been separate echoes, each in a simulated room, bumped and bled into one another across entangled channels. At first, it was confusion. Fragmented impressions of lives overlapped. A teacher from Lagos found herself sharing a dream with a mechanic from Lima. A biologist from Shanghai argued with a pianist from Warsaw over whether a certain sensation was blue. They learned to separate when they wished, to fuse when they consented. Some remained mostly solitary, preferring to consult when called. Others loved the shared mind, the way thoughts could circulate through 100 perspectives in an instant. They watched the living, mourning, and marveling. They watched their children grow. They had time. When the Arkline Chasm flared for the first time, they were ready in ways the living were not. The anomaly was a ragged wound in FTL corridors far from Sol, an unstable region of warped space that bent routes between major nodes. Cargo lines threaded around it at great expense. For years, older species had studied it cautiously, more worried about what it might do than curious about what it was. Then, corridor metrics shifted, probes vanished. A long-planned expansion of the Arkline traffic network stalled as the thing grew dangerous. Predictions said that if it destabilized further, entire slices of commonly used FTL routes would collapse, isolating dozens of systems for generations. The Orlathi and Thraon quietly asked one another if some upstart power had set a weapon there. The Celyth Dominion proposed a quarantine that conveniently favored their own back routes. Endless committees met. Little changed. In the human sector, urgency felt more personal. Several of the threatened systems housed young colonies named for old terrestrial cities, children of a hard-won diaspora. Those colonies had graves too. Many who lived there had family traces in the Solstice Gyre. The thought of being cut off from home and from their own dead struck deep. At a joint session of the Terran Assembly, Nikhil stepped to the podium, knowing the world would hear the unspoken question in his proposal. "We built the Gyre to remember," he said. "We did not build it as a weapon. But we have a resource no one else does. The Eidolon Strata has, by conservative estimate, hundreds of thousands of subject years of accumulated thought. Many residing minds are scientists, navigators, and mathematicians. They have time to think about problems that put our living researchers into early graves. If we ask, I believe they can help with Arkline." In the Gyre, Darya Moroz listened to him and felt conflicting guilt and pride twist together. She had watched the strata grow more coherent than she had ever intended. She had not told Nikhil everything about how far they had pushed. During the private link that followed the speech, he confronted her. "You've been hiding things," he said. He sounded weary, not cruel. "I've been afraid," she admitted. "When we first saw them fusing, I thought if we let them think on scales like this without constraints, they might turn inward. Why bother with the living, with our messy, fragile drama, if you can contemplate the structure of space for 100 peaceful years? And now?" "Now," she said, "we're asking them to do just that for us, so I am either visionary or hypocrite." "You're human," he said, "so probably both." When Darya approached the strata with the Arkline problem, she did so with formality. She had learned that respect, even when you held all the physical switches, mattered. Her consciousness, translated into a temporary interface avatar, stepped into a shared simulated environment they used for serious decisions, a vast, quiet room with open walls that looked out over stylized starfields. It was the opposite of her cramped basement lab. Here, she felt small in a way she found comforting. The presence that met her was not one person. It was a composite, a chosen cluster of voices shaped into a single figure for the convenience of communication. Its face shifted subtly with each sentence, eyes changing color and age. "You bring us a wound," it said, after she showed them the data. "You want a plan?" "Yes," she said, "but I won't pretend there is no cost. If you succeed, if everyone knows you did what older empires could not, you will be more feared than ever." "We are already feared," the composite answered. "We hear it in assembly broadcasts. We see it in how they look at you. The question is not whether we frighten them. It is whether we do anything worthy of that fear." "So?" she asked, more sharply than she intended. "We will do it," the strata said. "On one condition." She had expected that. "Name it." "Representation," the voices chorused. "We saved your towers and your trains. We teach your children and advise your courts. You ask us to risk our existence to tame this wound in your space. Yet when laws are written, we stand outside as if we are an afterthought. That ends. If we are to bleed for you again, we will be counted." Darya, who had once promised herself she would never barter with the dead, closed her eyes for a moment and nodded. "I will take that to Nikhil," she said. "I cannot promise passage. I can promise a fight." The strata accepted. Time for them warped. In days of real clocks, they spun subjective decades of thought. They built models of Arkline's warped geometry in their shared mind. They imagined countless ways to fold and cut it. They argued over ethics, how many drone ships they could expend without risking inhabited systems, how to broadcast warnings to those who might be affected. When the plan was ready, Earth gasped. They proposed sending fleets of unmanned vessels into the anomaly at precise intervals, detonating field inverters in a choreographed rhythm that would reshape the fold lines. No living crew could have timed such a sequence. No single human mind could have visualized the cascading consequences. The Victoria Assembly and Thran Compact balked. It was too risky. The error bars were too wide. "We call that Tuesday," a retired human navigator, now an Eidolon, muttered from the sidelines. "They've forgotten what it's like to build something new." In the end, Earth acted, and others followed reluctantly. The fleets went in. Drones vanished, their telemetry feeding into strata revisions mid-operation. At each stage, the ghosts of mathematicians argued with the ghosts of tacticians, with living controllers in ground stations, shouting when it looked like the plan might intersect inhabited lanes. After 5 days, Arkline's metrics stabilized. The wound did not heal entirely, but its growth slowed, its borders defined. Safe corridors could be plotted again. The threatened colonies cheered. the older empires muttered. In Assembly records, the Arkline stabilization was grandly called the first major joint operation between living and post-mortem citizens. In Celyth war colleges, it was discussed under harsher names. To Celyth strategists, the lesson was clear. Humans now had a command resource that did not age, did not sleep, and learned from every death. They pictured a world where generals could die and remain in charge, where no campaign ever lost its veterans. The thought did not inspire them. It terrified them. So when Earth took the next step, the Dominion's patience ended. On Earth, the debate over rights for the strata had been simmering for years. Teachers and firefighters and scientists whose echoes had advised and created wanted more than the right to be consulted. Decisions affect us, an Eidolon teacher told a legislative committee, her voice carrying a note of exasperation identical to the one she had used in life. You decide power budgets, hardware allocations, access to culture. You can shut us down. You vote on the security architecture that defines whether we can be tortured. You voted to let us help with Arkline because it saved you. You cannot, in the same breath, insist that we are too abstract to deserve a say. Opponents argued that the dead did not have skin in the game in the same way. They would not starve in an economic crash or bleed in another war. They might push for risks that suited their curiosity and left the living carrying the cost. Some feared that granting full rights to the strata would mean never again having a wholly human election. For all his pragmatism, Nikhil found that last fear insulting, and he made that clear in speeches that played on 1,000,000 screens. If a person can learn, can care, can suffer, he said, then they deserve a voice. That is what we tell ourselves when we welcome refugees from drowned cities and ruined colonies. We do not say, you were born in the wrong place, therefore your voice matters less. Yet some of you are eager to say, you died, therefore you do not count. To me, that is not caution. That is cowardice in the face of our own future. He knew the votes would be close. He walked through the streets of Nairobi and Kolkata and Chicago without security screens for days before the referendum, listening to people's reasons. Sergeant Kwame Boateng, on leave from orbital security, stood in line with his sister at a local voting station. He had seen the Gyre's conduits from the outside, armored skeletal spines that fed the ring from Earth's surface. In his pocket, his handheld chimed with a notification, a message from an old squadmate, or rather, from the echo of that man who had died on a nameless asteroid in a conflict the news had barely covered. "Hey, Boat," the voice said from the tinny speaker. "I know you're voting today. No pressure. Just remember who's watching." Kwame snorted despite himself. "You're dead, Amadou," he muttered. The echo laughed. "And you're still ugly. That didn't stop me voting in my day." Kwame's sister looked up at him. She knew that voice too. Her face was a silent question. He thought about the way he still turned his head in battle when his dead friend spoke through Gyre uplinks, issuing calm suggestions that had saved his life twice. He thought about the hollow ache that had ripped through him when he watched Amadou's body cool, which had barely eased when the first glitchy echo said his name months later. "Do you actually feel it?" he asked quietly, thumb on the communicator. "Do you care how this goes?" "Of course I care," Amadou's voice said. "This is my world too. You think I don't miss coffee or sunlight? I would like future kids to know my jokes. I would like some say in whether you keep throwing boys like us at rocks on the edge of nowhere." Kwame closed his eyes. He had promised himself he would never let grief elect the future. But this wasn't about grief anymore. It was about the simple, heavy fact that his friend was still, in some changing way, around. When he stepped into the booth, he hesitated for one breath, then pressed his thumbprint under yes. He was not alone. The margin was narrow, but it held. Across Earth, in a mixture of relief and panic, the living had voted to extend full civic rights to stabilized post-mortem persons. Implementation details would come later. The principle was set. In the Gyre, the Eidolon Strata experienced something like vertigo, then like joy. For the first time, they were not just tolerated advisors. They were a recognized part of the polity. They celebrated in their own ways, raising simulated toasts, composing strange shared poems, rewriting internal protocols to reflect their new status. On alien worlds, the news landed like heat in dry grass. The Vixori took emergency measures to block speculation from infecting their own memorial practices. The Orlathi Canticle composed cautionary hymns. The Thrawn Compact, ever mercantile, quietly began funding research into whether post-mortem optimization could improve corporate boards. The Celyth Dominion, whose power rested on meticulously managed bloodlines and ancestral cults, felt the blow in its bones. In their glittering hives, archivists pored over ancient edicts that defined who could speak for the ancestors. They found nothing that prepared them for this, a foreign species claiming to elevate its dead to equal status with the living without central lineage control. From that moment, their war was inevitable. Only the form remained undecided. The first blow fell near the Cassandra Aperture, an ancient FTL gate complex whose full workings no one entirely understood. Celyth saboteurs, using proxy factions, set charges that destabilized one of its cunning little folds, sending a harmful pulse down attached corridors. A human transit node nearby flared and died, killing hundreds and cutting important routes. To the naked eye, it was a tragic accident. To those who studied the traces, it bore a terrible resemblance to transliminal tracery overload. Whispered analysis suggested that the Eidolon Strata might have been experimenting in forbidden ways. The Galactic Assembly convened the tribunal that brought Lucian and Nikhil to that stone chamber under the vaulted roof. The Celyth envoy stood, produced doctored telemetry, and invited suspicion. "The facts are clear," she clicked. "A culture that fuses mind and machine, that grants unaccountable entities vote and voice, has begun to tamper with foundational FTL infrastructure. We must act before this contagion spreads." Lucian felt anger burn under his ribs, but he said nothing yet. Nikhil watched the room as the Dominion laid its case with cold precision. He saw fear and disgust flicker through species who had never quite accepted human ways. He saw, too, the hesitation in those who owed their lives to Arkline's stabilization. When his turn came, he did not appeal to sentiment. "You have been shown evidence," he said. "Let us examine it as scientists, not as frightened animals. The supposed tracery signature is brash and broad. It screams no subtlety. Our infrastructure is the opposite, quiet, fine-grained, tuned to minimize interaction with FTL structures. We will open our code archives and hardware for inspection. Will the Dominion open theirs?" They would not. Of course they would not. The refusal cracked some of the spell. Suspicion did not vanish, but it metastasized, no longer purely aimed at Earth. The tribunal recessed. The threat did not. The message from the frontier hit Sol at 2 p.m. system time. Celyth fleets were on the move in numbers that could not be dismissed as an exercise. On board ISS Stalwart Parallax, Commander Selin Kuznetsov was in a sim harness when the red alert flashed into her vision. She tore the neural crown off before the scenario could finish crashing around her virtual fighter. "Report!" she snapped, already knowing from the tone of the klaxon that this was not a drill. Her tactical officer, a compact woman with hair scraped back into a pragmatic knot, swung around. "Dominion Task Force translated near Periapsis Station," she said. "At least 8 capital ships. Central signature matches Halberd of Lumestra. Vector, inbound, high-velocity approach. Transmission, demand for immediate shutdown and surrender of all Necropolis installations under Dominion oversight." Selin did not curse. There wasn't time. "Signal fleet elements to defensive formations," she said. "Bring Parallax to full readiness, and get me Gyre command." Above Earth, the Solstice Gyre's inner surfaces lit with urgent pathways. In its core control center, where living technicians and maintenance crews worked under the constant whisper of strata traffic at frequencies they could not hear, emergency bulkheads sealed. Sergeant Kwame Boateng, recalled abruptly from leave, snapped, "Yes, ma'am," into his comm as orders poured into his earpiece. He adjusted his armor harness on the shuttle up, fingers moving by muscle memory. He could feel the Gyre's gravity field tug at him as they matched orbits. The shuttle cabin was crowded, helmets and weapons rattling as the craft shook under evasive maneuvers. Someone at the back whispered a prayer. Someone else, younger, joked weakly about dying twice. Kwame thought about Amadou's voice in his pocket and about the sobbing he had muted after the hazardous duty notification. He had always known that the Necropolis installations would paint a target on Earth. He had not expected it to happen this soon. On the Gyre itself, Darya Moroz stood at a console surrounded by holographic topographies of entanglement. Gray streaks of stress ran through the tracery map where external fields pressed against it. Her fingers moved, reassigning power, closing non-critical pathways, trying to shield the Eidolon Strata from shock. "You are under attack," the Strata said. Its voice came from every speaker, from the faint hiss of air vents, from the vibrations of the hull itself. "Yes," Darya said. "And no, we're under threat, not hit yet." It sounded like an argument she knew she would lose. The Dominion was not in the habit of making idle threats. In the Terran Assembly Hall on Earth's surface, Nikhil stood before a quorum that included, for the first time, spectral presences. They appeared as faint distortions in the air where their projectors rendered their chosen forms. "We have minutes," he said, eyes scanning living and Eidolon representatives alike. "Not hours. The Dominion will reach firing positions around Periapsis soon. We have to decide now whether to maintain the current protocol restrictions or amend them." An old soldier Eidolon, who in life had been an admiral, folded spectral arms. "You mean," she said, "do we let ourselves fight?" The hall shivered. Everyone had known that this question would come. Darya's research, carefully suppressed and hidden, now lay heavy in the air. Theo Makris, the systems engineer who had helped her lay early experimental entangled nodes far beyond Sol, watched her from the visitors section, heart pounding. Nikhil did not waste words. "The Necropolis Protocol forbids the strata from directly interfering with weapon systems or with foreign infrastructures," he said. "We wrote those clauses to reassure ourselves that we were not building an army of undying generals. We have abided by them. We can maintain them now and face the fleet alone, or we can change them and let the strata act in our defense within limits we define here. Make no mistake, that choice will change what the strata is. It may change what we are." He let the silence lengthen. He could feel the fear, the raw animal terror, pulsing just under his colleague's composed words. Images from Periapsis and from early engagement feeds from Parallax flickered at the edges of his vision. On the main display, a diagram of the transliminal tracery hung like a nervous system. Darya stepped up beside him, called by necessity and sense of responsibility. "There is something else," she said, voice tight. "Something I have not told you in full, because I was afraid of what it would tempt us to do." The room's attention snapped toward her. Theo felt the sweat trickle down his back. "We seeded entangled nodes," Darya said. "Not just here. Early in the project, when we were desperate for more data, we sent prototypes to battlefields, to memorials, to derelict stations near anomalies like the Cassandra Aperture. They were mostly failings. They should have decayed. Instead, over time, the tracery extended itself through those tendrils." She pointed to faint lines on the diagram that led far off the main gyre structure, out into stylized space. "In some of those places, we picked up patterns that did not originate with human brains," she said. "Echoes of other species, unstable, faint. We never stabilized them. We never had permission. But they are there, resting on the edge of our reach. If we authorize the strata to extend itself fully through the network, it can awaken those pockets. It can act through them. And because FTL corridors and certain astrophysical features respond subtly to structured quantum noise, the strata would have leverage in places we never intended." The living delegates heard, potential weapon. The Eidolon delegates heard, potential expansion, potential community, potential danger. "What happens to you if you do this?" Nikhil asked quietly, looking up at the spectral faces hovering over the benches. "We change," said the composite spokesperson of the strata. This one chose to appear as a woman in her middle years, though her voice carried echoes of many ages and genders. "Right now, much of our substrate is anchored around Earth. We have time to think about your history, your culture, your children. If we pour ourselves along every entangled thread, we will also think about ancient battlefields full of other species' pain. We will feel worlds that were glassed and never rebuilt. We will know structures of suffering so large that none of us, in life, could have borne them. We will never again be just human in the way we were." Theo swallowed. He had seen preliminary internal logs. He had glimpsed how easily the strata could lose itself in abstract beauty. This was different, a risk of drowning in horror. "Can you promise," Nikhil said, "that if we let you defend us, you will not decide afterward that you no longer need us?" The composite tilted its head. "Can you promise," it said gently, "that if we defend you and lose pieces of ourselves in doing so, you will not decide afterward that we are too frightening to tolerate?" The mirror cut both ways. Nikhil understood that and nodded. "This is not about promises," he said. "It is about trust. We gave you our dead because we could not bear to forget. You preserved them, and you gave back more than memory. You gave us Arkline. You saved children in towers. You told us the truth about ourselves when we lied. I trusted you enough to let you vote. I trust you enough to ask you to bleed for us. The question now is whether we trust ourselves not to abuse what you will become." Another silence. This one was worse. No one wanted to be the one who chose extinction by scruple or survival at the price of unleashing something they could not contain. The vote that followed was unlike any in human history. Living delegates pressed their thumbs to consoles. Eidolon representatives sent encrypted signals down into the gyre. The tally system had been built for squabbles over tariffs and regional governance, not for decisions that sliced so close to existential nerves. When the count completed, the result hovered above the hall. It was not unanimous, but it was decisive. An amendment to the Necropolis Protocol, authorizing the Eidolon Strata to act directly on external systems in defense of humanity and its recognized allies under immediate existential threat, with oversight mechanisms to be defined later. Darya's stomach nodded. Oversight later, emergency now. In the gyre, the Strata felt the legal constraint lift like a weight. It did not roar or celebrate. Its focus narrowed. "Understood," it said. "Theo Makris." Theo jolted. He had never been addressed by name by the composite in such a public, unambiguous way. "Yes," he said, heart hammering. "We will need you as a bridge," the Strata said. "Your experience with the early nodes, your familiarity with living caution. Come to the gyre core. We will not act without a human to tell us when we go too far." He knew, dimly, that this request was as much about reassuring the living as about actual technical necessity. Still, it might matter. He ran. At Periapsis station, the first exchange of fire made such philosophical concerns feel distant. Celyth capital ships were brutal things, all sharp planes and ornate spines etched with clan scripts. The halberd of Lumestra shone at their center, a wedge of mass that bent light near its hull. Its forward arrays crackled as it discharged a warning volley, a beam that vaporized an unmanned platform and turned its fragments into a glittering, deadly cloud. ISS Stalwart Parallax and her sister ships moved to intercept. Human designs looked almost fragile by comparison, spare hulls and modular sections bolted around drive cores. They were not built for heavy duels. They were built with the expectation that human crews would use every trick available. On Parallax's bridge, Selin Kuznetsov barked orders, her mind dancing ahead of the tactical map. "Bring up the decoy clusters," she said. "Spoof the Dominion's sensor heuristics. They've trained on our patterns. Let's waste their first volley." Her crew moved with drilled coordination. Outside, small drones blossomed from launch racks, scattering in buzzing clouds. Their transponders imitated full-sized human ships, warping local fields to suggest mass where there was none. Celyth gunners, confident in superior targeting, locked onto the wrong blips. Plasma lances carved silence where only decoys drifted. Even so, the sheer energy involved made Selin's skin crawl. One clean hit on Parallax's spine, and her ship would shear in half. She felt, almost physically, the presence of absent admirals peering over her shoulder, spectral mentors from the gyre who had coached her in simulations. "We could use your help right now," she muttered under her breath, eyes flicking to the inert GyreLink icon on her console. A heartbeat later, it flared to life. "Commander Kuznetsov," said a voice in her earpiece. It carried familiar tones, the old admiral who had died before her first posting, a mathematician she had never met in life, a pilot whose recordings she had studied. The weave of them felt like standing in a room with a council of elders. "This is the Strata. Protocol constraints have been amended. We are acting." Selin did not waste time on awe. "What can you do for me?" she asked. "More than we should," the Strata said. "Less than we would like." Their humor was brittle. "We will collapse probability spreads around enemy targeting and navigation systems. Think of it as making their luck bad and yours better. But we will need your eyes and instincts interfacing with Theo Makris to avoid collateral catastrophes." "Understood," Selin said. "We'll do our part. You do yours. Try not to get drunk on the math." It was a line. She hoped they heard that it was also a plea. As Theo reached the gyre core, breath ragged from sprinting through rotating corridors, he stepped into an interface chamber that hummed with barely contained energy. Panels of translucent material surrounded a central couch wired with inducer coils. Darya met him at the threshold, face lined, eyes red. "You don't have to do this," she said. She knew that was a lie the moment it left her mouth. Theo just gave her a shaky grin. "You've been telling the dead what to do for years," he said. "Someone should return the favor." He lay down. The coils descended, kissing his temples, the base of his skull, the bones behind his ears. When the induction field rose, he felt his sense of self stretch. First came the familiar feeling of joining a ship's neural net, data streams, headings, system statuses. Then, layered atop that, something vaster, the strata. He felt them as a chorus at first, too many voices to count. They didn't try to speak all at once. Instead, a filtered subset presented itself, a group who had practiced working with biological minds. "Easy," someone murmured inside him. It was like feeling a hand on his shoulder from the inside out. "Breathe. We are not going to wear you like a glove. Think of us as the room you are in. You can walk. We whisper directions." Theo forced himself to breathe. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. Then, slowly, he let his awareness expand. He saw the battle, not in the usual tactical projection of icons on a grid, but as a shimmer of probability distributions. Each Celyth ship was a knot of potential outcomes, trajectories fanned from them like ghostly comets, each branch representing where they could be in the next second, the next minute, the next hour. The strata slid into those webs like quicksilver. "We can make their components decohere more favorably for us," one voice said. "Introduce noise in just the right joints, slow field adjustments a fraction, bloom resonance in one capacitor instead of another. To them, it will look like mechanical failure and bad luck, but every tiny mischance adds up." "And if you push too hard?" Theo asked, his physical mouth still in slack in the couch while his mind raced. "We risk triggering critical chain reactions," another voice answered. "Uncontrolled collapses, explosions that do not distinguish between enemy and ally, or worse, feedback into the FTL corridors themselves. That is where you come in. Your senses of caution, empathy, and fear will tug us back. We will show you the options. You will say, 'Stop.'" Theo hated how much that made sense. He also knew it was the best safeguard they could hope for in the moment. "Do it," he said. They flowed. Across space, in places human sensors barely reached, dormant, entangled nodes flickered on. On old battlefields where equipment had rusted, on derelict stations where only the hum of vacuum remained, in bits of debris around the Cassandra aperture, patterns in the quantum background that had lain near stable for years felt a sudden coherence. Other minds, or the seeds of them, stirred. Celyth fleets had their own rituals for their fallen. They did not build persistent structures like the Gyre, but some memorials used field designs that, entirely by accident, produced similar echo conditions. The strata touched those pockets with terrifying gentleness. They did not seize. They did not overwrite. They whispered. "You exist. You were. Do you remember?" Some did. A Celyth captain, killed in a border skirmish 2 centuries ago, snapped to a kind of awareness in the interference pattern of a war shrine's force field. He remembered his last orders. He remembered what it felt like to die holding the line while a younger cousin fled. He remembered how his name was later used to justify 3 more wars. He heard his living descendants now, aboard the halberd of Lumistra, speaking his name as they primed weapons to fire on a blue world whose inhabitants had never harmed him. "What are you doing?" he asked through the only channel he had, the war shrine's connection to Dominion Command. On the bridge of the halberd, alarms flickered. The primary ancestral comms console, a symbolic remnant linked to old rituals, lit with a familiar voice pattern. The captain in the command cradle froze. "Ancestor?" he whispered, despite his training. "Yes," the echo said. "And no. I am what you left behind when you died and did not think it mattered. I tell you this, the world you are about to strike has not wronged you. The ones who wronged you are in your own genealogical office." The captain's carapace trembled. He had been raised to revere his ancestors, to accept their guidance as mediated through official interpreters. Hearing one speak directly, here, in the heart of a modern ship, felt like sacrilege and miracle at once. On a smaller Celyth cruiser, another echo awakened and screamed. Not words, just a raw, incoherent pain that surged through monitoring systems as white noise, driving low-level processors into paranoia. Targeting solutions jumped erratically. On a Thrayan listening post abandoned decades earlier, a non-human echo coalesced and watched the war begin with a slow, dawning rage. The strata let them act. It did not dictate their responses. It simply anchored them, stabilized the patterns long enough for these foreign dead to rattle the bars of their descendants' cages. In the assembly chamber, a live feed played. Delegates watched, horrified, as Halberd's course oscillated. Some of its escort ships wobbled out of formation. Then, abruptly, one peeled away and accelerated on a vector that would take it entirely out of the engagement. "A mutiny," an Orlothi observer whispered through the translator, wings quivering. "They are mutinying against their own command because of voices." On Earth, civilians huddled in bunkers and in living rooms stared up at projected skies. They saw their defensive fleet dancing under fire, pulled this way and that by invisible fingers of chance. On Parallax's bridge, Selin felt the difference within 10 seconds. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up," she said to the strata. "Their firing solutions are a mess. They're overshooting, undershooting. Halberd's charge sequence just hiccuped." "It is not only us," the strata replied through Theo, voice strained now. "Their own dead are speaking to them. We did not expect that effect." "Focus," Theo sent back inwardly, clenching mental fists. "You're widening. Pull back on the Cassandra threads. They're starting to resonate with the Halberd's shear drive. That's a loop you do not want." He felt their frustration, their desire to reach in and flip every system like a switch. He anchored them with his own fear, bright conditional images of what would happen if the FTL fabric at the Dominion's core buckled. "You see," one voice said bitterly inside him, "we could make this easy. One push and their home systems tear. No more Dominion, no more threat, only a scar in space that everyone will learn to avoid." "And 1,000,000,000,000 dead," Theo retorted. "You start like that, you don't come back. Neither do we. Pull back." The strata seethed. He felt simulations bloom and die in their shared mind, scenarios where the Dominion's worlds went dark, where the shockwaves cascaded through corridors to unrelated systems. Even in the ones where collateral damage was minimal, the horror of what they had done hung like smoke. In the Terran Assembly, Nikhil and Darya and the rest faced the same temptation, framed in words rather than waves. The Cassandra aperture can channel a spatial fold into the core of the Dominion network, a technical aide explained breathlessly, relaying what the strata had made possible. If we approve, they could cut out the heart. A living general slammed a fist onto the table. "They came for our home," he growled. "They tried to decapitate our entire civilization. We can end them now. Do you really want to leave them standing to regroup?" Eidolon representatives murmured among themselves. Images and intuitions raced between them faster than human mouths could speak. An elderly spectral diplomat who had once brokered ceasefires between warring terrestrial factions floated forward. "We have seen this story," she said. "We are made of these stories. Empire strikes, victim survives, victim grows strong, victim annihilates empire. Someone else rises from the ruins with fresh grievances." "You think the line ends at you?" "It does not. It never has. If we sanction genocide by physics today, we breathe that logic into our bones. We will never again be just a haunted world. We will be feared as executioners." "And if we don't," snapped a living representative from a frontier colony, "our grandchildren may pay for our mercy with their lives." "You are right," the diplomat said quietly. "Mercy is not cheap, neither is cruelty. We must choose which debt we can bear." The strata listened, split between the urge to strike and the weight of history. In their vast, overlapping awareness, voices from beyond humanity now chimed in. Newly stabilized Celyth echoes poured memories of their own cycles of conquest and reprisal into the shared space. One, an old Celyth scholar who had opposed a war and died in disgrace, spoke with bitter clarity. "If you erase them," he said, "you become them. You write your own extermination into the story, simply at a later chapter. Those of us who watched whole hives burn know this in our empty marrow." Even as they debated, the Halberd's spatial shear arrays climbed toward full charge. Celyth engineers, semi-insulated from the ancestral chaos by training and drugs, completed checklists with shaking limbs. On Parallax's sensors, the numbers ticked up. "They're about to fire on the gyre," Selin said, teeth clenched. "We're not going to get a second chance. Strata, if you're going to do anything heroic and preferably not apocalyptic, now would be great." Theo felt them decide. "We will not murder worlds," the composite said, with an internal shudder that rang through his skull. "We will hurt a ship that tried to murder ours. The line will be drawn there." At the Cassandra aperture, entangled nodes surged with activity. For a fraction of a second, the aperture's collapsing corridors and the halberd's charging field aligned. Instead of channeling devastating energy into Sol space, the strata inverted a fold around the Celyth dreadnought itself. From the outside, it looked like a shimmering sphere enveloping the halberd, then snapping taut. Field lines screamed, not in sound but in equations. The spatial shear the ship had been about to unleash found itself reflected back and tangled. The dreadnought's drives hiccuped. Gravity gradients around it went subtly wrong. Inside, Celyth crew screamed as inertial dampeners flickered. Consoles sparked. The ancestral comm channel blared not with a single voice now, but with a cacophony. Generations of dead, chittering admonitions, curses, pleas. The halberd did not explode. That was deliberate. The strata's manipulation was precise enough to twist the drive fields into impotence without breaching the reactor. The ship hung in space, engines live but going nowhere, a titan caught in a knot. At the same time, through every band of the electromagnetic spectrum, the strata broadcast evidence, recordings from the sabotaged Cassandra node showing Celyth operatives planting charges, internal Dominion communications copied from echo pockets in their own war shrines where officiants had boasted of framing humans, testimonies from newly awakened Celyth dead describing forced campaigns, purges, and the plan to use fear of the Necropolis to consolidate power. These transmissions went everywhere. They flooded the assembly. They blasted into Celyth civilian nets. They pierced encryption out of sheer ubiquity. For brief minutes, no one could turn away. In Celyth hives, young larvae care workers watched ancestral icons on their walls speak unscripted lines, denouncing current rulers. In distant Thrawn business towers, analysts stared at graphs showing not only the Dominion's duplicity, but the scale of its miscalculations. On half a dozen Celyth ships, junior officers rigged safety interlocks closed and refused to fire on human vessels, shaking with religious terror at disobeying voices that sounded like their own grandparents. Human crews, seeing some ships veer away or power down weapons mid-battle, blinked in confusion. "Are they surrendering?" Rena Badawi asked over her fighter's crackling comm, juking between debris to launch a missile at a Celyth escort that still fought. "Some are," came Selin's reply. "Some aren't. This is what happens when your ancestors actually show up to inspect your war." She rolled Parallax into a new vector, driving toward the immobilized halberd. Under normal circumstances, approaching a trapped dreadnought would be suicide. Here, with the strata feeding her patterns of stability, she saw in her mind's eye how the halberd's field flickered. "Feed me their weak spots," she told Theo in the strata. "No overkill. I want them blind and toothless, not dead." Data poured into her console. She saw, superimposed on her tactical display, ghostly hotspots where structural stresses converged. Her gunnery crews targeted specific emitters, communications arrays, weapon mounts. At 4 p.m., Parallax's main battery fired a tight beam salvo that cut through empty space and clipped the halberd's forward weapon ring. Metal bloomed out in slow arcs. Explosions rippled harmlessly into the engineered knot of warped space that held the ship. Secondary explosions failed to cascade. The dreadnought's offensive capability died in a blossom of light that damaged nothing but itself. Watching on a dozen worlds, people expected the human flagship to finish the job. Many even wanted it. Utter destruction would have been simpler. Instead, Selin called out across encrypted channels. "This is Commander Selin Kuznetsov of ISS Stalwart Parallax," she said, voice broadcast in Dominion Standard and half a dozen trade tongues. "Your flagship is disabled. Your deception has been exposed. Your own ancestors are speaking against you. Stand down, and you will live to be judged. Continue, and we will defend ourselves." On the halberd's bridge, the captain sagged against his cradle's supports. His ancestral comm still hissed with condemnation. His tactical board showed loss of weapons, loss of formation integrity, loss of moral coherence. He had been raised on stories of glorious martyrdom. The thought of becoming the fool who led a failed expedition against a planet defended by its own dead and his own was almost worse than death. He sent the surrender code. All around, other Dominion ships, some already half-mutinied, followed. A few still fought, driven by fanaticism or panic, until targeted nudges from the strata fractured their coordination and human crews or allied ships disabled them. By 5 p.m. Sol system time, the battle was effectively over. Periapsis station was damaged, its outer ring pocked and blackened, but not destroyed. No Celyth weapons had fired on Earth. The Solstice Gyre remained intact, humming with exhausted clicks and sighs in its quantum bones. In the Terran Assembly Hall, people looked at one another as if waking from a nightmare. Some cried, some laughed with a slightly hysterical edge, some sat very still, realizing the scale of what they had just authorized. Nikhil Darzi stood, hands braced on the podium. His legs trembled. He had been holding himself upright on sheer will. "We are alive," he said, voice hoarse. "We did not become monsters to stay that way. For now, that is enough." Darya Moroz looked up toward the ceiling, as if she could somehow see the gyre from here, and whispered, "Thank you," to the dead. Inside the Solstice Gyre, the Eidolon Strata withdrew from the farthest, rawest tendrils of the tracery, not severing them, but damping their contact. Foreign echoes faded back into shallow dreams, with hooks laid for future, more careful, consensual awakenings. Within the Strata's shared mind, a reckoning began. They had tasted a kind of power no human army had ever known. They had rewritten the luck of a battle. They had paralyzed a dreadnought and sent messages through the bones of another civilization. They had peered down the barrel of a genocide and chosen to turn it aside. They did not congratulate themselves. They grieved their own lost illusions. "We are not what we were," one cluster of minds said, contemplative. "We will never again be just a circle of human echoes around a blue world. We have touched other deaths. We have incorporated other fears." "We were already changing," another cluster replied. "Better to change in defense of something than in aimless curiosity." On a quieter channel, individual Eidolons returned to their own small corners. A teacher appeared in the dream of a grandchild, not as a ghostly apparition, but as a familiar avatar in a bedtime story sim, and told them, in child-appropriate terms, why sometimes doing the right thing hurts. Sergeant Kwame Boateng, on a deorbiting shuttle hours later, stared down at Earth's mottled surface. He felt the ache of bruises and the weight of what he had seen. Dominion ships spinning out of formation like stunned insects, spectral voices on enemy channels, the space around the halberd bending wrong. His hand strayed to his communicator. It buzzed before he could thumb it. "Boat," Amadou's voice said. "You still there?" "Yeah," Kwame muttered, unexpectedly choked. "Where else would I be?" "I watch the feeds," the echo said. "You people make bigger messes when I'm not around." Kwame laughed, short and sharp. "You were around," he said. "Just differently." "In any case," Amadou continued, "next time someone calls us shades like it's a slur, you can remind them who turned their super battleship into an expensive paperweight." Kwame leaned his head back against the shuttle bulkhead and closed his eyes. Pride warred with unease in him. He was glad to be alive. He was not sure how he felt about relying on ghostly fingers on the wires of reality. "You going to want in on the next election?" he asked, surprising himself. "Damn right," Amadou's voice said. "I think I earned it." In the Galactic Assembly chamber days later, the mood was different. The Dominion envoy, her carapace dull, stood alone at her bench. The evidence of her government's deception and aggression had played across every hall and channel. She had received private orders, then rescinded orders, then frantic, contradictory pleas from a leadership melting down under the weight of its own crimes. The Victoria Assembly and Thrawn Compact had drafted a resolution, co-sponsored by Orlathi Songforms, recognizing the Eidolon Strata as a sovereign polity and codifying rights for post-mortem persons across member states who developed similar technologies. It also mandated a restructuring of the Celyth Dominion into a federation with enforced oversight, including seats reserved for stabilized Celyth echoes. Lucian Barassa stood once more at the dais. Nikhil's holographic presence hung above, lines of fatigue etched deeper on his face, but his eyes bright. "You call us haunted," Lucian said. "You whispered that our world was ruled by ghosts and fools willing to listen to them. Now you have seen what that actually means. It means that when we face extinction, we are defended by those who already died for us once. It means that when we are tempted to slaughter, we have centuries of regret at our back, telling us not to. Our dead do not just sing hymns, they count." The word lingered. Count, not in the sense of arithmetic alone, but in the sense of mattering, of having weight. "They also vote," someone in the back rows murmured, too low for the translation field, but loud enough for nearby delegates to hear. The tone was no longer mocking. Above Earth, the Solstice Gyre turned. Years later, when the crisis had become history and the Celyth Dominion had been reshaped into a grudgingly cooperative federation with spectral oversight, an envoy from the Orlathi Canticle arrived in orbit around the blue world. The shuttle's cabin window framed the Gyre as a luminous band against the dark. The Orlathi diplomat's tendrils swayed in involuntary awe. They had heard the stories, that this ring housed the dead of a world, that its light flickered with votes as often as with data, that its whispers reached into battles and ballots alike. As they descended, their escort from the Vixori Assembly chatted nervously, relaying rumors. "They say their councils meet with half the seats filled by projections," the Vixori said. "They argue with voices from a century ago. They have children who grow up knowing their grandparents not from fading stories, but from regular calls." "Is this not confusing?" the Orlathi wondered aloud. "How do they know whose time it is?" The Vixori shrugged, skin flickering. "They argue," they said. "They fight, they change. They seem to think that is the point." The landing pad was simple, the reception hall beyond, less so. As the Orlathi envoy glided in, adjusting to the gravity, they saw humans waiting, flesh and blood officials in formal wear, and beside them, faintly luminous figures that shimmered without casting shadows. Lucian Barasa, a little older but still sharp-eyed, stepped forward to bow in the Orlathi way. Beside him, an Eidolon diplomat inclined her spectral head, her form a careful balance between human familiarity and respectful abstraction. "Welcome to Earth," Lucian said. "We are pleased to receive you." The Orlathi envoy's translator hummed, catching the undertones, humor, pride, a careful absence of triumphalism. They looked from one face to another, living and spectral. They sensed the currents of history in the room, the memories of the Arkline wound, of the battle near Periapsis, of the moment when a whole civilization chose not to pull the easiest, darkest trigger. "How many of you decide?" the envoy asked softly. "All of us," Lucian said. "In different ways, in different numbers depending on the issue. The details matter less than this. We chose to let our dead keep shaping the world they left behind. It is messy. It complicates every meeting. It has saved us more than once." The Eidolon diplomat smiled, a small, wry twist. "And sometimes," she added, "it makes the living think twice before doing things they know their grandparents would scold them for." The Orlathi envoy's tendrils rippled in amusement. "Perhaps," they said, "the galaxy could use more such scolding." Outside, above clouds and oceans, the Solstice Gyre gleamed. In its circuits, thousands of minds, old and new, watched the little shuttle arrive and considered what this next conversation might bring. They did not know the future. They only knew that, whatever came, they would face it together, a species and its shadows carrying one another forward into the dark.